Okay, I think we are live. You want to take us away, Matthew?
We are. Hello, everyone. Matthew Hagum. Nice to have you here with us today. I am one of your co-founders of the Accounting Alchemy Network, joined by Ingrid, of course, as many of you know. And we came together several months ago to really bring together a community of like-minded accounting professionals under the premise of one question. And that question is, what can we do to transform the accounting profession into a vehicle for positive social change? And so with that, many of you have already attended some of our live streaming sessions or our webinars or our Lyceums, as we call that. We recently had a social forum where we brought a few of you together. We've started a book club. We've got a lot of great conversations going on in both LinkedIn and in Facebook. So thank you to those of you who have engaged with us in that space. And needless to say, my tongue is tied up today. Needless to say, we have an awesome conversation planned for you this afternoon. So I'm going to pass it over to Ingrid, who will introduce us to the topic and introduce our speakers, and then we'll get started. Over to you, Ingrid.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today, we're doing something a little different. We are bringing together two people from totally different fields who have never met each other. We had one very brief, like, hey, can we have an effective conversation? They don't know each other's work. And we had a brief conversation where we got to understand just the smallest amount of their differences and their commonalities. So today, we don't know what's going to happen. This discussion is an experiment in bringing together some big ideas that may clash at times, and that also may have congruencies and may have things that we can't unpack in the limited time that we have in our Lyceum today. We're going to give it a shot anyway. Our main objective in this is not to just get big brains in front of you to offer education, but to demonstrate what it looks like to open ourselves to new ideas, question our assumptions, and embrace diverse viewpoints to synergistically come up with new questions and potential solutions that maybe none of us have thought of before. So our topic today, and like I said, we're coming up with new questions. We're going to be going through some sunbursting, which is there a better question behind that question? Let's come up with a better question. The question that we're kind of starting with around this conversation is, can ESG help us in a post-growth world? How would that work? What is ESG? What is post-growth? We're unpacking a lot of really big ideas today. And with that, we have Donny and Donny. Donny Shimamoto and Donny Maclurcan. It's been all kinds of fun for me because I've had D and D on like everything in my schedule related to this conversation. So I feel like I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons right now. Donny Shimamoto and Donny Maclurcan. And rather than me going in and introducing each of you, I would love for each of you to introduce yourselves. Starting please with Donny Shimamoto. Would you please let us know a little bit about you and the work that you do in the world?
Sure. I'm going to give you the version. So I am a CPA. I'm a non-traditional CPA, so I don't know tax or bookkeeping. A lot of what I do is work in the innovation space. Most people out of that as technology. Today, it's also changes in business practices. Part of that is the way that we change the way we're making decisions and what information we use to make decisions, which then is into ESG. So that's a lot of the part of the perspective. The other half of what I do is risk management, and I now call it integrated risk management. So it's looking at the whole picture of risk, which also ties into enterprise risk management as one of the areas within ESG.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Donny Maclurcan, let's learn a little bit about you and the amazing work you're doing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Donny Maclurcan. I'm the Executive Director of the Post-Growth Institute that has been in existence since 2010. We're across 16 countries. We look at what comes after capitalism and what comes after economic growth, which we'll delve into a little today. We work at the community level. My own work has been in community development, also working with over 500 businesses around the world in seeking business transformation to fit within ecological limits, to have business models line up with what it means to be truly sustainable. And then I'm also a professor of economics at Southern Oregon University in the US. And my work there is particularly around debt flows, money flows, and macroeconomic theory.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Cool. And Ingrid, if you don't mind me, I'm going to jump in and ask Donnie.
Please.
So one of the things that's really important, as we've experienced in our preparatory sessions, and certainly inside of this community, is sharing language, right? Sharing common definitions around certain terms. So Donnie, would you mind just telling our audiences what ESG actually means, and maybe give us some context to what
Donnie
it
S.
is?
Let's throw this one to Donnie S.
Donnie S, what it is. Please, thank you.
It's coming to me. So ESG, environmental, social, and governance reporting. For those of you that have been with the accounting profession for a while, this is kind of the reboot of what we saw as integrated reporting in the 90s that evolved into sustainability, corporate social responsibility, within the last maybe 10 years. And then now it's coming forward as ESG, which is bringing a lot of these different things together. So the E is really environmental, which a lot of times we're looking at sustainability. There's other aspects. The middle is social. So Cole, I think, gave a really good emphasis into this, because part of social is safety, whether it's employee safety, customer safety, community safety. So we've got social. We've also got things like the not using slave labor. And so that's kind of the really short social. Governance is really at the way that an organization makes this, how it's governed. So to tie it into the accountant space, corporate governance is really going to tie into that. Ethics for us as accountants ties into this, making ethical decisions. And then risk management, cybersecurity also falls in this, because it's the requirement to protect, for example, private information. So that was the super quick, like, ESG, different aspects. And hopefully through all of that, you all can see why these are basically all non-financial aspects. And so this is the next wave of reporting coming in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Donnie. And Donnie Maclurcan, in a similar vein of defining language, I would love it if you could describe to us what a post-growth world might look like.
Well, that's a great question. And before I address what it might look like, let me just sort of define post-growth a little. And one of the ways to define this is by looking at our existing system. Our existing system actually is growth dependent. And when I say growth dependent, I mean economic growth dependent, such that, as you might imagine, when we have situations where the economy doesn't grow at a national level in terms of GDP increases, there's a freak out. We talk about recession if there's 2 quarters and heading in the wrong direction in that way. And it's not just that that's fundamentally problematic for national governments, for individuals and their back pockets. It's that this sits in a context that's linked to ESG, particularly the environmental side of this, that we live on a finite planet. We have a planet that has limited resources other than the solar energy that's coming in. We have limited mineral use. We have limited fossil fuels. We have limited certain things in terms of environmental inputs. And as a result, when you have an economy that always has to grow, which if you unpack it actually means the money supply always has to grow, that you have to have more debt being introduced into the system, which is the way that money gets introduced in, is it's loaned into existence. Then what happens is you actually get over time the very problems that we see in our current system that require ESG, for example. You get economic inequality, you get a breakdown in terms of social cohesion. These are actually byproducts of a growth-based system, and we can unpack that later if needs be, because in a growth-based system, debt always expands and just moves around in the system. And so a post-growth system actually says, how do we disconnect our economy from the economic growth dependency and actually have a system that's driven by well-being, where money and profit and these sorts of things are actually a vehicle for that greater purpose, which is to flourish within ecological limits. How do we ensure, given we cannot disconnect economic growth from the impacts that the economy's growth has environmentally, how do we talk about a system where we can actually see innovation and markets continue such that we have a flourishing market economy, but we're not continuing to draw down on the ecological reserves and create all of the problems that we're seeing at the moment in terms of environmental and social. So that's a post-growth world. It's a vision for a system where we move beyond those challenges.
So brilliant. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Donny. And I guess I would love to toss it back to Donny Shimamoto now to kind of pose the overarching question. We might think of a deeper, better question after we check in about the overarching question. You teach about ESG at accounting conferences and within corporations and things like that. From your experience in teaching about ESG, can ESG help balance business decisions in a post-growth world? And if yes, how? If no, why not?
Of course, we asked the question because we believe it can. But I also want to point out that ESG is not a completely new thing. That's why when I explained it, I went back to from a reporting standpoint, meaning companies providing information about what they're doing. It actually goes back to the 90s. When we look at this balancing of decision making, we can also go back to the 90s with balanced scorecard, more recently with conscious capitalism. So all of these things are trying to balance out the way that decisions are made so that it's not a profit only or economic benefit only type of a decision. And that's where I think a lot of this is coming from, is this is just another tool in our belts to ensure that we're taking a look at the broader picture. And Donnie did a really good job of painting. There's a lot of different aspects to look at, but it also, the economic point that we're at now, or that we will be at in the very near future, is shifting. And we can't make the decisions the same way that we've made them in the past.
Thank you, Donny S. Donny M, over to you. And I think my question for you is, so I know, and maybe you can give a bit more context, that you don't come from the accounting world, and now here you are in a room of accounting professionals, and we're like having it out on this conversation about ESG. And I think one of the distinctions that that I find very present on, for example, your website, and if you look at some of your material, is this idea of post-capitalism. Now, I don't necessarily want us to go that deep down the rabbit hole on post-capitalism, but I think it's interesting because, as accounting professionals, we are in the context of now operating inside of the systems that we're operating inside of to address this reporting. And yet you talk about a future that we're hopefully perhaps aiming ourselves to. So I guess the question that I have for you, and maybe it's a broader question around social impact, really is what are you suggesting that we pay attention to, that we start to measure as we think about this thing called ESG and navigate ourselves towards this better future that's possible for us?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Matthew. And to be honest, I'm super excited to be having this conversation with accountants, because my passion for this is around the actual accounting of what's happening in terms of monetary flows globally, and how that actually then leads to the need for things like ESG. I'll unpack that in just a second, but to answer your question directly, I think some of the most exciting things are, to build on Donny S's points, to look at what's happening here in terms of like the future fit framework, which is being introduced, that accounting professionals, I think, are starting to see intersect with governance professionals around the world, who say, let's look at what are some more holistic models that go beyond integrated reporting, that go beyond CSR, that go beyond ESG. And I think we're getting a lot of media coverage at the moment that's seeing a critique of ESG that in parts is both founded and perhaps unfounded. So there's another model, which is the economy for common good, which has an incredible social balance scorecard. And these ones that are emerging, the systems that I'm seeing in the quasi-accounting field, because they're not traditional accounting methods, but they have crossover. What I like about them is they're typically much more comprehensive than, for example, your B Corp scorecard. And they're starting to ask questions about financial flows a little bit more, not just where your investments are, but where you're sourcing money, or where the flows of money go in terms of shareholder versus non-shareholder models. And I think that's interesting. And I also think that there's some fascinating things here where accountants might be might be interested as well. Like I remember with the Economy for Common Good scorecard, there's now proposals in the Netherlands which say, why don't we offer lower corporate tax rates for businesses that are scoring in certain levels in these kind of scorecards? I just noticed, for example, and this is a little tangential, but the Triodos Bank in Europe is now offering a lower interest rate loan for houses that are built with certain materials. The point of all this is that there's like this beautiful opportunity, I think, in the accounting world to bring in some of these questions around actually looking at a broader notion of accounting and intersecting those with some of the emerging things in this field where people are trying to say, how do we actually get results here? Which is essentially what ESG was meant to be about. And that leads me to my earlier point, which is that from an accounting perspective, there's something that just doesn't add up in our current economy. And it's not a story that gets told, actually, even in the circles that I'm in. So if we were to, for example, to say, what do you think about, what's been happening in terms of global economic growth, capitalism, the story of wealth production, and the notion of rising tide lifting all boats? What typically gets put forward in presentations, especially cases of economic growth or sustainable development, is for people to say, look at the China story, right? Look at how much incomes have grown. The question I would ask, and this is what I think accountants would be particularly interested in, is, well, what about the other side of the balance sheet? What has happened in terms of debt growth? Most of the time you see income growth, and this is something to think of, when you see an income growth graph, ask yourself, are they going to show me the debt graph that's correlated to that? Because those two things are related. And in fact, the ratio of debt to money supply in the world is around 2.8 to 1. The amount of debt, 2.8 times the amount of debt to money supply. And that has been deleveraging in terms of those two things separating out over time more and more debt getting piled on. And that makes sense if you understand how corporate bonds and government bonds get added into the system. Without going too deep into that, my point here is, as an accountant, there's something interesting, which is you can connect the dots and say, all right, there's this whole debt issue when you have a money supply system that has to constantly grow, and we could unpack why that is. But if you just accept for a moment that that happens in a growth economy, the money supply always grows and debt always grows faster than the money supply, then what happens is you get this split, this separation between who's got the money in the economy and who holds the debt. Typically, it's governments and households and small businesses and a lot of zombie businesses that are holding this debt. And the reality is that in a capitalist system, that debt always grows and it just gets shared around and hidden, like, let's reduce the debt in this way. Let's, we're going to reduce the national deficit or reduce the national debt. The reality is you're just moving things around in a fungible kind of way. And that then leads to the reason we have ESG in the first place is because there's a lot of externalities baked into a system that's focused on profit maximization. And so you're trying to fix a lot of the problems that the very system itself creates. And that's what I'm particularly interested in.
Thank you, Donny M. Ingrid, I see you came off mute. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Do, please.
Okay, please. Thank you. So Donny S, I see you shaking your head over there. And, Donny M just shared a lot of really important, valuable information. I think one of the questions we get asked in our journey in these conversations is, okay, yeah, but why should accountants be concerned with this conversation? Why is this a place for us to exist? And I think Donny, you maybe pointed, Donny M, you pointed to a few things that would make it, suggest that it makes perfect sense. But I'd love to hear from you, Donny S. Like, what is your sort of response to Donny M, and what's resonating with you, and why would you say that this is an important conversation for accountants to be having?
Yeah, everything he said resonated with me. I was nodding, especially too, because this is actually also a little different than our prep call, which I was like, oh, I like what he's saying as he's describing this. So one, I think, just to level set before, the part of our role as accountants, because it was interesting that Donny said we have to go kind of, I forget if he said beyond accounting or but accounting is actually not the specific term. Accounting is the general term, and finance associated with money is the specific term. So a lot of times what I say is accountants need to go beyond finance because we're not just about the dollars. And that's where ESG starts to come in. When you look at the root of what we do as accountants, there's two things that we do. One is we count, and two is that we have standards around how we count. So when you think of it that way, when I'm counting carbon outputs or whatever, right, I'm standardizing that way. And part of our objective as a profession is to ensure that there's comparability as I'm looking at different organizations. So that's a large part of what we're doing. And also that there's consistency. So both of these come back to the standards. There's consistency in the way that someone is reporting, so that whether it's Brazil versus the UK versus the US, when we say something, we're all this published report, right? And then the looking at whether the standard has been applied consistently, that's the auditor's role. And so it's a very different role than I think what a lot of especially smaller bookkeepers, smaller accounting firms tend to forget. They tend to brush off. I hear them brush off a lot of the role of audit, but it's operating a lot in a larger company where there's a lot more judgment around how you actually compile the financials. So there's those aspects of it. As I bring in audit, the third aspect of what we do as accountants is really look at internal controls. And so controls is looking at, is there a system, and I don't mean technology, I mean system in the broader sense, is there a system within the organization that is ensuring that the data that's being produced by the organization, whether it's financial or non-financial, is consistent, applying the standards, and that it's also has quality and is reliable. I can use it for decision making. So the whole concept of risk and controls comes into play around the data, but then tying back into this whole, there's a bigger picture that we're working with. This was bringing in ethics in the governance and ESG, because we're not making decisions only upon that bottom line. A lot of times what we're having to do as accountants is, even if I'm in favor of a particular thing or I may benefit from a particular thing, I need to take a step back and go, what does the public think about this? Because our duty as accountants, and especially as CPAs, as licensed accountants, our duty is to the public and to help protect the public. So it's making sure that the data that's reported is accurate, is completely properly represent the picture, and then ensuring that this lens of ethics and objectivity is coming into decision making. That's where, again, even though let's say I didn't care about the environment, I'm like, we should just do it. I'm technically obliged to take that step back and say, well, I can see their concerns, so let me figure out how to work with this, right? I may not work with that organization for a long time, but that's what it is. So that's why I'm nodding a lot, because I'm hearing a lot of it's like, yep, we role to play this, and we need to bring these things up, and we need to ask questions, because how we got to today, how we're going to get through the future.
Love it. Thank you. Well, and that right there, like this kind of conversation is why we decided to call these meetings Lyceums, Lyceum being the venue where Socrates and Plato and their compatriots used to get together and discuss big ideas, philosophize, and even debate as a form of education. So, we're bringing it back, being able to disagree in respectful, healthy ways, talk about new ideas, and celebrate the diversity of ideas and how we might be able to, using, I'm learning a lot recently about sociocratic discussion methods and consensus conversations. How can we come up together with better solutions than any one of us would think of on our own? So with that, I want to bring in some questions from the people who are watching this conversation right now, because we actually have a pretty good active group of people who are watching this live on Zoom. And the first question I want to toss first to Donny Maclurcan, and then same question to Donny Shimamoto after Donny Maclurcan has a chance to chew on it. Dan Luthi is asking, how can we adapt as organizations when we live in an economy that is based more on intellectual property than on GDP, knowing that intellectual property is often overinflated as it relates to tangible goods?
Well, if I understand that question, it's a great question. And if I understand it correctly, I guess I would say that what I see happening around the world that really gives me a lot of encouragement and gives an idea for how to adapt is that the whole picture is changing in terms of where economic competitiveness is shifting. And so if we take, for example, intellectual property, and not many people know that in the US, for example, the US is number one export industry is IP. And maybe that's what Danny was alluding to. And so, but the reality is that aspects of the opposite, given IP is about enclosing knowledge in certain ways, I think that aspects of that are really being shaken up, especially with what we've seen with COVID, in terms of the notion that if you're going to hold on to your knowledge, you're not going to be as responsive when we have these global challenges emerging. And we've seen that with groups like Johnson & Johnson opening up their IP, et cetera, and Tesla putting its patents into the, removing those from their business processes. What we're seeing really is an understanding that moving more into the commons and the sharing of knowledge is actually one of our best hopes to work our way through the challenges we're facing, but also that actually leads to business competitiveness. So you're now starting to see in some of the accounting mechanisms that I've encountered, groups will actually score better in certain aspects if they are opening up their knowledge in ways and actually seeking to be proactively collaborative. And that's an anathema to capitalism, right? Capitalism is always about protect, defend, and seek to accumulate. But I think that it's very hard if you're a company, and this is what we saw with Linux, many moons ago, when they moved into this space of open source development in terms of coding. And then IBM tried to go in and buy out as many Linux developers as they could so that they could control what was an open source approach. And then they discovered that they couldn't do it. And so they gave up. And now a lot of IBM is built on open source approaches. And I'm going into the weeds here with this answer, but my point is to say this, the market shifts, and it shifts in ways that are really interesting and I think should be really of interest to accountants. It shifts in ways that often you can't control. So the best businesses, the biggest businesses, the largest businesses in the world will try to control narratives, they'll try to control markets. But the reality is customers, sentiment changes. The reality is that our conditions, especially with the environment, change. And as a result, certain business models change over time. So my response to Dan is that the sands underneath which most of the business community globally exists are shifting. And they're shifting in ways that I believe are actually, despite every protestation from certain corporations in this world, are actually shifting in a direction that is more benevolent, requires and rewards better, more genuine approaches, which is where we get back to this ESG thing. How genuine is your approach? How real is what you're doing, and how much of it is window dressing and CSR? And I think we're seeing a shift in that business model competitiveness towards businesses that actually care and actually live by their values.
Yes. Oh, fantastic. Well, and I love that you brought in how genuine is their approach. And it's so funny to me. One of the articles we posted on the Accounting Alchemy Network in the last couple of weeks in preparation for this discussion was an article regarding the little fit that Elon Musk threw because Tesla fell off the top 10 list of ESG companies. And he's like, how is it that Tesla's not on the list, but ExxonMobil is? And it's like, well, it's kind of within your industry also. There's a lot of different things. And this article responded with some great education. But then right at the same time, I'm like, Elon Musk, you just dropped 75 tons of carbon emissions into our atmosphere by launching a rocket into space. Is your environmental focus really genuine when that's what you're choosing to do with your money after the profits are made within your business? I mean, really? So, and I want to say, Dan Luthi also posted a follow-up in the chat. He said, exactly. It seems to be the reason why the market is so volatile and why we're seeing part of the impact on the markets. So I would love to hear Donny Shimamoto, kind of same question, the GDP versus intellectual property, and how can we adapt as organizations when that is our current economy?
I would actually modify that a little bit. And I'm actually curious once I say this, whether Donnie M actually agrees. I don't think it's GDP versus IP. I think it's GDP versus speculation. And the biggest thing we're seeing, it's present in the stock market, it's present in the impacts on gas and everything else we're seeing right now. It's present in the VC world, especially, also to a limited extent, maybe not even limited, to an extent, the private equity world, right? The venture capital world and private equity world. All of this is speculation that is driving these valuations up, because the valuations is not based upon the tangible goods. And I think that's what Dan's going towards. If we look at the tangible goods, what's actually on the balance sheet, or especially in the asset section, that's only this much. When you look at the valuations, it's this much. So, which is all speculation on whether or not this company is going to do something fabulous or not. And so that's why sometimes a lot of times actually, I think like the stock market is broken, because it's so much real estate as well. It's all of its speculation until it bursts. And it's just a matter of us waiting for it to burst.
Awesome. Donnie Maclurcan, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I'm so glad that Donnie S just mentioned that, because it allows me to understand a little more about the question. And so all of this that was just described is absolutely an inbuilt feature of capitalism. Why? Because the fundamental principle of any form of capitalism, conscious capitalism all the way to free market capitalism, is accumulation. You would invest on the basis of seeking to get a greater financial return from that investment. And where I think a lot of people from an accounting perspective maybe lose track of what this means in terms of actual flows is they think, well, investors then go and they take their money and they reinvest in the economy. But the reality is that if any of us on average were accumulating a whole lot more money, even in stocks, etc., we are going to, if our net wealth increases, we're going to keep more money over in a bank account, right? The billionaires of the world keep roughly 10 to 15% of their money in liquid assets, so that if they're the Elon Musks of the world, they have the ability to say, I'm going to purchase Twitter and use some of the stock money I'll sell off, but the other money I've got sitting in a bank account. The point of all this is that when money accumulates in bank accounts around the world, whether it's a government's bank account, a company's bank account, or a household's bank account, because again of this way that money and debt, anytime you create money in the system through creating a loan, you have to create an equivalent debt. And think about like when you go and you get a mortgage on a house, right? New money enters the global money supply, and there's also new stocks of debt that didn't exist before. The point of this is that when the money accumulates, which it does in a capitalist system, because there's not enough avenues for it to flow back. You know, if you got taxed at 100%, then it wouldn't be capitalism. You wouldn't bother to invest in the first place, right? If the amount of philanthropy that you gave was the exact same amount, 100% of your overall profit, then again, you wouldn't be in it from a capitalist perspective. So money accumulates, it doesn't get fully reinvested back in, and we see bank accounts growing. When money accumulates in certain people's bank accounts, the debt has to accumulate elsewhere. And what happens then is you've got wages over here, the general population, and limited access to money, which is why you get downward pressure on wages. It's why so many people are fighting for increase in wages, etc., because there's downward pressure globally on wages. And then to Donny Shimamoto's point, over here, on the other hand, the money that's accumulating, what are people going to be using it for when they do invest it? To make more money. How many assets are there? Well, in a world that only can create certain amounts of real value versus speculative cryptocurrency, NFT value, there's only a certain number of things you can invest in. And we know that when there's a whole lot more money accumulating in limited assets and you invest, you get inflation. So we get downward pressure on wages and asset inflation, and it's pick whichever asset class is your favorite in a country, and that's the one you'll see getting the inflation. And so that is baked into our system. And all of the work we're looking at, if you're an accountant working on aspects of carbon accounting, etc., you're essentially looking at a problem that has a fundamental underpinning in terms of the separation of money and debt that creates this inequality, that then creates a wealthy elite that have a much higher footprint, that ecologically, all of these things. So there's this important accounting underpinning of the dilemmas that we're facing.
Brilliant. And so Dan Luthi posted again, he said, love the consideration towards speculation. Netflix is an example of an organization's wealth that is based on speculation. And when the market puts pressure on that speculatory reasoning, they start cutting staff. The hope is that with reasoning like this, we can see the refocus on speculation to be towards ESG for those new reinvestments. So thank you so much to our participants actively watching and for participating actively. Yay, super, super fun and exciting. Matthew, you unmuted, go for it.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I love our participants too, so thank you for being here. I have a question. It's a series of threads, so I'll share them with you all. From Mariette Martinez. And really what I appreciate about Mariette's question is I was gonna say holding our feet to the fire, but it's really holding our feet to the grass, if you will, or to the ground. And the question is more so, let me just find it one second. So it's this, based on this conversation, are we assuming accountants have a strong enough financial background to even follow this conversation? I mean, you've talked a lot about different things and both of you have been working in your respective industries for a while, and you've got this depth of experience and knowledge that kind of empowers you with the information to be able to understand and discern things. And so therefore, her question is, have a strong enough, couldn't this be an issue if they can't even if accountants can't even get the conversation, right? And then why is it so important to get involved? Or simply put, if accountants are not literate and have the awareness, what can we do to even just help them understand that building awareness is a part of the process and stepping into that more clearly? Yeah, I think that's a summary of her question.
Yeah, and how to simplify these ideas to make them more entry level. I guess the question is, who do we want to toss that by first? Donny Shimamoto, you unmuted, go for it.
I'll jump in since it's more accounting education. So this is where this is a emerging topic. It is one that I say we, those of us that are leading the accounting profession, are trying to get in front of everybody. I just spent 2 weeks on the road, 6 different cities, including 2 international countries, and 1 virtual, so 7 events in total. And ESG was literally on every agenda, but most of the ESG talk on the agenda was around what is it and why is it important, right? So we're still at the very early stages of that. We see a lot of the attention around it in the investments world. BlackRock, several of the others have all kind of put forward, this is important, we're investing around this, you should know around this. So we're still, to me, again, kind of in the early stages. And what we typically see in the accounting world is it starts in these large corporates and then there's a trickle down into private and otherwise. Mariette in her comments had also mentioned integrated reporting came up in the 90s. Part of the accounting history timeline, integrated reporting came up, started to gain, and we also saw enterprise risk management also start to gain traction around there. In 2000, we had the whole scandal, of course it's escaping, Enron thing. We had the whole Enron issue occur, which pushed everybody back into internal controls. And so the profession actually took a huge step back. And it wasn't around 2013 that we started seeing a view towards, well, let's look more towards the future. Now we think we've got financial reporting back under control. So we had the reset in 2013. And then within the last, again, kind of 3, 4, maybe 5 years, we're seeing the whole sustainability and everything start to come back up, right? So that's part of why we're behind again, and we're having to build this back up. I would say there's a confluence of things occurring. One, more awareness, I think, and more buy-in into some of the things EM is talking about. The shift in the population as well, so or the decrease in the population, which also says we're not going to grow right now, looking at it right as a population, and so that should trigger other things to happen. So there's a confluence of things that are happening that I think is bringing this back to the fore. Now, if I go back down to her question, which is how do we get accountants? Now I'm going to differentiate a little bit, and I'm going to apologize in advance because I know sometimes people see this as elitist. The difference between a bookkeeper that does this compared to CPA or accountant that does this. And these are very complex things, right? There's a difference in the way that you would approach them for a big company versus a small company. And so what we do need to see first is a little bit of the trickle down in how does this actually apply to smaller entities? How would they report it? However, these are also less complicated. So if we can actually figure this out, I don't think we have the answer yet, but I do have it as one of the things that I want to push, which is let's figure out how we do this in a smaller entity. It is simpler. You know, I work with a restaurant. I can figure out generally what the carbon emissions are. I don't need a full engineer to do that. I can look at whether they're doing slave labor. I can look at their COVID health practices, other things, right? So I can actually do a simplified model. Right now, there's just not the demand for it. And it's kind of the catch-22 that we're in. So is the public demanding this information to go and patronize the small business? If there's not the demand, then there's not going to be the need for the accountant to do it. So it's about raising awareness and increased willingness by the public to make decisions based upon this, which I believe we're from the research with the Gen Z that's becoming more important to them.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Donnie, I see Donny Maclurcan, I see you unmuted and know that you want to follow up. And I want to add just a little bit of extra question to your follow-up because Marriott posted again saying we need more real life examples like what Dan Luthi gave us on Netflix. She loves the sharing and it's been around for a while. We need to learn the fundamentals. I know, Donny Maclurcan, that you have a lot of some great real world examples of purpose-based businesses that are doing really, really well and have, you know, better bottom lines, you know, when it comes to purpose-driven profit instead of personal-driven profit, are healthier businesses than a lot of the ones that are just there for wealth generation. So yes, I would love for you to respond and maybe toss a couple examples in here that maybe we can research after this call, since we are starting to come to our time.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do. I want to come back to Marriott's question and maybe complement what Donny S is saying, but from a different angle, the bookkeeper angle. So let me give you the headline and then unpack it a little. For me, the bookkeeper angle is a really interesting one because my passion is in terms of accounting for not-for-profit forms of business. So not traditional nonprofits that are charity dependent, but nonprofit organizations or consumer cooperatives or government enterprises or foundation-owned businesses. So different forms of business that don't have private individual equity owners. And in there's a wonderful amount of space for the accounting profession to really adopt and engage with a model that maybe to a lot of accountants isn't familiar. When I was working in Australia with not-for-profit organizations, the typical approach, and this is the same within the legal profession, is to think of business as for-profit and non-profits as charities only. And so you would typically see accountants and lawyers doing pro bono work in the non-profit sector. Well, something interesting happened over the last 35, 40 years, and you can see the work of Lester Salomon and others that have highlighted this, is that non-profit organizations around the world went into business. In fact, more than 50% of nonprofit revenue these days is self-generated. So the notion of charities is actually quite rare. In fact, less than 20% of nonprofit funding globally, and this is across data from 40 countries, comes from charitable contributions. So in reality, we're in a totally different landscape, and especially because nonprofits often contract to government. What that means is that traditional bookkeeping accountants can be playing in a field where nonprofit organizations are doing things that they would encounter in the for-profit sphere. And in fact, you're actually dealing with a new complexity because you've got both donors and clients that you're working with, and thinking about how to actually upgrade the systems, whether it's online bookkeeping software, etc. There's huge avenues for growth, as you know, Ingrid, working with a nonprofit business at the moment. So that's one side to the question, and then the other side is, Mariette, I think that you're asking a fundamentally important question. How do we engage people? This is a short conversation. We're going into complexity. There's two different pieces here. And I want to give you an out-of-the-box answer to your out-of-box question. What I do to bring people into the concepts that I've thrown out today, a little carelessly perhaps, is I start with a drawing exercise. And I ask people to imagine what a future that's working for everyone actually looks and feels like. And then I ask them, what does the present economy feel like? And what's interesting, having done that experiment for 8 years all around the world, across every kind of audience you can imagine, including accountants, people consistently across all cultural and other differences will draw one of 4 symbols or shapes for the future that's working, and one of 4 symbols or shapes for the present. And for the future, they'll either draw a circle, a spiral, an infinity symbol, or a heart. And then for the present, they'll either draw a jagged line, a triangle, a downward arrow, or a mess of lines. The takeaway, the linearity that's built into our current system, and is built into a lot of accounting practices as well, never matches up with what we know actually needs to happen. Fundamentally, we know that flourishing systems rely on circulation. And so that's my entry point then to have a conversation with accountants about, so you account for these things. Where are the pieces, if we live in a system that's linear, and you know the future needs to be nonlinear for us to survive as a species, where are the things you're not accounting for? And how can we explore those edges so that you can contribute not just to being a good accountant or being a good CPA in terms of the public good, in terms of what accounting might be considered right now or even next year, but in terms of actually participating in some of the biggest conversations that are going on in the world, which is, how do we get out of this mess? And that's where I think accountants have a really, really powerful role, especially because you're interested in looking at what are we accounting for, and are we actually accounting for everything that needs to be accounted for?
That was so good. Matthew, take it.
Yeah, I know we're coming up on time, and I don't want to open up another Pandora's box here, but I do have a question.
Sorry, Matthew, if you're going to switch, can I add to that first?
Sure, and it might be related, but say what you need to say, and then we'll see what happens.
Okay, so I completely agree. The nuance is what are we accounting, what else are we accounting for? That's where the ESG comes in. So I want to bring it back into that these are the things that we're trying to account for. And that's where part of it is we do need the standards around what we're accounting for, so that everyone's not doing it in their own way and it's all different. So that's kind of the quick tie. Sorry, I just wanted to wrap that into this is where that's going. So completely agree, and I think that's where it's going.
Yeah, thank you, Donny S. And I think when I hear what you're saying, Donny M, and I'm excited about what's possible for this profession, and the fact that I think our profession has the opportunity to play a really key role in shifting us to a new future. And I'm going to use this word. I don't like this word. And yet, in spite of that, Donny S, you've been working with CPA firms, big CPA firms. I mean, you're engaging with individuals who occur to be fixed, and I say that specifically, occurred to be fixed in their mindset, right? So what's your take on how we can begin to create the space for the possibility that this, and I was triggered by your sort of linear versus non-linear thinking, Donny, and it's like, how do we invite accountants into the space of non-linear possibilities in a world and really in a population that's been trained and been told that they in fact are not capable in some cases of this quote non-linear thinking? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I actually think that's a really big misrepresentation. So most people's perception of accountants is tax return and bookkeeping. Those are the two things. When you look at the profession as a whole, there's a lot more that we're doing. And one of the biggest things that we're doing is we're problem solving. but we're problem solving within constraints. So within the standards and laws and regulations, what can the business do to do whatever it's trying to do? And I shouldn't say business, organization, because it could be a nonprofit, it could be a governmental entity, it could be an individual family if I'm working with an individual family at a personal level. Right. So what can whoever it is do within the constraints of the law and regulations? And a lot of that's nonlinear. Right. So creative problem solving is part of what we do as accountants to look at whatever it is we're looking at. What we need to do is to bring in the framework around that thinking. And that's why, as Marriott indicated, this is a big thing. There's a lot of complexity. We need to unpack it a lot. And so can we actually simplify a lot of that down? Now, when you look at the really big companies, that's where I think a lot of us start to become skeptical. Well, they're navigating it to get the best economic benefit, right? And game the system. It may be true, maybe not. And we've given some examples of somewhere it's not. And I think it's important from the examples that Donny M gave that there are companies that are not doing this gaming. They're actually doing it right, looking at the broader picture, making decisions based upon that. And that those are the models that we have to encourage and emulate more. And part of the role of accountants is to look at these, because part of what we do is we look across multiple businesses and go, well, you know, they're really successful and they're doing this and this and that and making the decision in this way. Shouldn't you be doing that too? And that actually falls into part of the governance aspect of ESG also. So that I think that's how we start to look at, you know, this broader picture to get it also from the big, also down into the small. Because you know, the bookkeeper, if the bookkeeper is at a point where they can actually influence the business decision maker to say, you know, I saw this company and they really, they're anti-LGBT. Should we really be patronizing from them? Here's an alternative that actually is going to get you the same price, or maybe it's a little more. Are you willing to make that change, right? Those are simple things that we can do by keeping our own awareness around which companies we want to see people do business or not do business with.
Fantastic. Donny Maclurcan, do you want to follow up? Oh, we've got clappy hands. I think Marriott is applauding you. Love it when the emojis float up the screen.
Yeah, just a brief follow-up, because I love this, you know, the revealing of what really accounting is about, that Donny S is speaking about, that more holistic approach and the creative problem solving. And so I want to just paint a scenario for those listening to explore by way of an example, given that the request was for an example. So imagine you were invited into a contract to do some accounting work, IKEA, right? IKEA, the furniture company. Now, you might think, okay, this is a big corporate contract. Let's say it's with their headquarters in Sweden, not one of their subsidiaries around the world. You might say, all right, this is going to be a pretty traditional kind of experience in terms of being in a big corporate and working on things. And maybe I'm doing some accounting of the more broader sense. Well, years back, I went to a sustainability conference and I ended up sitting with the heads of sustainability of IKEA all at the same table. They didn't know who I was, they didn't know my background, so they weren't prejudiced in terms of knowing what questions I was going to ask. And I asked them one simple question. I said, given IKEA is a non-profit organization, which might be news to people on this call, IKEA is a foundation-owned business, it has no shareholders. Given IKEA is a non-profit business, does that affect how you do sustainability at IKEA, given you don't have shareholders? And they all said, almost in unison, 100%. They said, when we show up in the office, we don't have the constraint of needing to think about a bottom line with respect to shareholders or private partners, etc. My provocation to you all watching this is the following. Have you ever thought about what it would be like as an accountant to go into a big corporation where the accounting that you're getting to be creative with in terms of regulations and what you can do within that space is not compromised by the persistent over-the-shoulder needing to also think about what the bottom line looks like for shareholders? And if you haven't thought about that, know that there are 20% of global GDP forming businesses that fit that model. It's an untold story, and that accounting in those kind of businesses might actually feel different. And to maybe think about where you're doing your accounting and that opportunity to explore a different form of accounting experience that's a little less compromised in that regard.
Oh my goodness, I love this so much. We've got more clapping hands going up. And with that, we're getting close to time. So I want to pose one more question kind of to wrap us up, hopefully concisely, because we've got Dan Luthi saying this is an amazing conversation, wish it was longer. And Marriott's like, that's why I'm clapping, we need a part 2. And part of the part 2, as discussed in the chat just a little bit ago, this differentiation between the high level CPA accounting technicality and the bookkeeping aspect, the more management accounting aspect of it. It sounds like we've got a call to have Donny Shimamoto and Marriott Martinez kind of do a little bit of a part 2 discussing some of those things from those different perspectives. So that might be an upcoming Lyceum. And we might also need to have Donny Maclurcan back at some point, because there's so many great ideas here. And with that, I want to toss one more question into the ring. The question being, what is the next step in this conversation? What is a better question? Because the questions going through my head right now is, okay, so what more specifically needs to change? What would an effective decision-making framework look like? So my question is, are those the right questions to be asking, or are there better questions for next time we get together to talk about these kinds of topics? And Donny Shimamoto, I'm going to toss that your way first, and then I'll toss it your way, Donny Maclurcan.
Well, I purposely gave the examples of all the different frameworks and things because I don't think there's one answer, but it's choose something else. And I actually was going to add to what Donnie M said, which is, I don't know, and there's nothing actually in our training as accountants that causes us to go in with the profit motive. There is a question of whether or not something that we're doing or looking at aligns back into the corporate strategy, the business strategy, which may be growth or maybe not. Right? Because one of the strategies might be to embrace ESG and do something. So I think often what we're coming into is come in and analyze. The message that we want, I think, is to not only look at traditional ROI, but look at all of these different factors, whether using ESG, conscious capitalism, better balanced scorecard, whatever it is.
Beautiful. Thank you. Donny Maclurcan, same ideas. What's our next step here?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't have any answers. I really don't. All that I can reflect on is that where I think there's an interesting intersection is about, and I sense from you, Donny S, like a commitment to expanding or reigniting or maybe even reclaiming the notion of accountant as something broader than tax returns and bookkeeping, and that just as maybe lawyers, when I think of the etymology of that term as being actually community healers, I could imagine that accountants could be those keeping us accountable in the broader sense. And in this sense, to me, that's where that conversation could continue. It's just like, what does it mean to be accountable in the broader sense? And what does it mean for accountants to become ever more the heroes of our stories and our societies, and seeing accounting as a profession that can really hold huge amounts of pride in terms of how it seeks to hold to account that deeper knowing of where things actually need to be measured and where things actually need to be recorded, reported, and ensured that they are within frameworks that are agreed upon and standardized.
I'm listening to you, I'm getting chills because one of the things that we do as accountants is we are often not the decision maker, but we are probably one of the #1 influencers in decisions that are being made. And so I think what you just said really is the call to action to us. And I saw Marriott agreed with the kind of the direction on the bookkeeper can be this influencer against the small business. I think we found that path. Maybe Marriott, we need to tease this out and make it more actionable. That is the key. And this is also why I formed the Center for Accounting Transformation, and our URL is improvetheworld.net, because I fundamentally believe that accountants, because of our influence, the way we're going to lead to this better world.
Well, thank you, Donny S. Thank you, Donny M. And of course, thank you to my fellow co-founder of the Accounting Alchemy Network, Ingrid, for guiding us in this conversation. We are at the end of our conversation. So first of all, I guess I have to respond to this idea of what's next. Well, it does sound like we have some more follow-up presentations, or at least some content to share out. So I'm going to invite both of the Donnies here today. If you have something you want us to share with the network, please do reach out and let us know. Otherwise, for those of you who are viewing this, if you're viewing it on YouTube, please look both of these two people up online, look at their websites. You'll find some really powerful information that will help to open up your eyes. And I think for me, what's next is there's a lot of juicy stuff inside of this conversation, even just one term, right? I think the thing that keeps coming back to me is this post-capitalism. Be with that information and follow that curiosity and let that inform the next piece of curiosity that you might have in this conversation. Because I think, to your point, Mariette, the more curious we are about the possibilities, the better we all are in opening our eyes to what can be done. And so a few other notes about the Accounting Alchemy Network. Of course, if you go to the accountingalchemy.net, you can sign up for our newsletter, stay informed on what's going on. If you do sign up for our newsletter, you'll get invited to join us in one of our social networks where we have some of these conversations on an ongoing basis. So if you have a desire to be a part of that community and that conversation, please reach out to us. We're always happy to welcome you. Ingrid, any other final comments before we end our recording today?
I think we rocked it. I also have chills, and I so many just delicious sound bites. I'm looking forward to going through and taking little clips to turn into memes or something. Maybe I'll leave that part to Mariette because she's our social media maven. Thank you everyone so much for participating in this fantastic conversation. Thank you to Donny and Donny, and looking forward to finding more ways to save the world with each of you. Thanks so much.